James had always taken great pride in his front yard vegetable garden, a lush and vibrant patch of greenery that provided fresh tomatoes, cucumbers, and bell peppers to his family and neighbors. It wasn't just a garden, it was a symbol of self-sufficiency, a labor of love cultivated over the years. But his idyllic slice of paradise was about to become the center of a bitter war with the neighborhood's homeowners association, HOA. The conflict began when Nancy, the HOA president, a woman notorious for her strict and often arbitrary enforcement of community rules, set her sights on James's garden. She had a reputation for ruling the neighborhood with an iron fist, nitpicking everything from mailbox colors to the acceptable length of grass. It was no secret that she thrived on control, and James's defiance of her authority was something she could not tolerate. Her disdain for his garden was not just about aesthetics, it was about power. She considered James a troublemaker, someone who questioned the arbitrary rules that she enforced. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a formal letter, typed in an overly professional font, informing James that his garden was in violation of HOA regulations. The letter stated that he had 30 days to remove the garden or face daily fines. James read the notice, shook his head in frustration, and decided he would not be intimidated so easily. James was no stranger to standing his ground, and he knew that the HOA didn't have the authority to dictate what he could or couldn't do with his own property. At least, that's what he believed. He decided to fight back, gathering every document he could find related to his property's legal status. He soon uncovered something that should have ended the dispute immediately: a grandfather clause that exempted his home from many of the HOA's newer restrictions. His house, built decades before the HOA was even established, was legally protected from certain rule changes. Confident in his findings, he wrote a response to Nancy, citing the legal documents and demanding that the violation notice be revoked. But Nancy was not one to admit defeat so easily. Rather than acknowledge his exemption, she doubled down. Within days, James received another letter, this time with a fine attached, a significant sum that only fueled his determination to resist. Nancy's refusal to recognize the legal exemption wasn't just bureaucratic incompetence, it was a deliberate power play. James realized that if he didn't take a stand, she would continue to bully him and others in the neighborhood who might not have the means or knowledge to fight back. One morning, James woke to the unmistakable rumbling of heavy machinery outside his house. He rushed to his front door, heart pounding, only to find 3 massive bulldozers lined up along the street. Standing beside them was Nancy, arms crossed, a smug smirk stretched across her face. "You were warned," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Since you refused to comply, we're taking matters into our own hands." James felt his blood boil. This wasn't just about enforcing a neighborhood rule, this was a blatant act of aggression, an attempt to break him. He could see neighbors peeking out from behind curtains, watching the standoff unfold. Some looked sympathetic, others indifferent, but no one stepped forward. The sheer audacity of the act left James momentarily speechless. His garden, his hard work, was about to be destroyed before his eyes. He had no choice but to act fast. "Touch this land and you'll regret it," he said, voice steady but firm. "You have no legal right to do this." Nancy laughed, waving a stack of papers in his face. "This says otherwise," she taunted. But James wasn't about to let her win. With no time to waste, James sprinted back into his house, rifling through old paperwork, searching for the one document that could save his garden. He remembered his grandfather mentioning something about the land's unique legal status before he passed away. After what felt like an eternity, James found it, a contract from decades ago, proving that when his family sold portions of their land to developers, they retained certain rights: mineral rights, utility easements, and most importantly, an exemption from HOA regulations. It was a game changer. But would it be enough? He immediately contacted Martha, the county clerk, a woman known for her meticulous record-keeping and no-nonsense attitude. When James explained the situation, she didn't hesitate. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, she said. True to her word, Martha arrived, official documents in hand, and marched straight up to Nancy. "These papers," she said, waving them in front of the HOA president's face, "clearly state that this property is exempt from your rules. If you proceed with this demolition, you'll be violating county law." The color drained from Nancy's face as she snatched the documents and read them. James watched her expression shift from confidence to rage. She had lost this round, but she wasn't done yet. Just as Nancy was attempting to argue her way out of the situation, the wail of sirens cut through the tension. Sheriff Martinez, a man well respected in the county for his fairness and firm hand, stepped out of his patrol car and surveyed the scene. His eyes landed on the bulldozers, then on Nancy, and finally on James. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice calm but authoritative. James wasted no time explaining the situation, showing him the documents Martha had brought. Sheriff Martinez listened carefully, then turned to Nancy. "Is this true?" he asked, holding up the papers. Nancy, still clinging to her last shreds of control, huffed indignantly. "This is a private HOA matter, Sheriff. We have the right to enforce our regulations." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "Not if those regulations violate county law," he countered. He turned to the bulldozer operators. "Stand down. If you proceed, you'll be trespassing and liable for property damage." The men hesitated, looking between Nancy and the sheriff, then slowly powered down their machines. Nancy's jaw clenched so tightly it looked like she might break a tooth. James could see the battle wasn't over. She wasn't just angry, she was furious. And people like Nancy didn't walk away quietly. This was just the beginning. Just as James was catching his breath, an unexpected voice cut through the tension. "Enough is enough," came the trembling but firm words of Eleanor, an elderly neighbor who had lived in the community for over 40 years. She stepped forward, her silver hair catching the morning light, her cane tapping against the pavement. "Nancy, I've watched you and Robert bully people for years. It's time someone put a stop to it." A murmur rippled through the gathered neighbors. Eleanor wasn't just speaking for herself, she was speaking for the entire community. "You think we don't know?" she continued, her voice gaining strength. "You and Robert have been skimming money from the HOA for years. All those special assessments we paid for the pool renovation, where did that money go?" James's eyes widened. This was bigger than just his garden. Eleanor was talking about something that affected the entire neighborhood. Nancy's face paled, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for a response. But before she could regain control, Eleanor turned to the crowd. "I have proof," she said, holding up a thick envelope. "Bank statements, invoices, fake company names, it's all here." The neighbors gasped. James had been fighting for his land, but now it was clear Nancy and Robert had far more to answer for than just an illegal fine. As the crowd pressed in, whispering amongst themselves, James took the envelope from Eleanor's trembling hands and quickly scanned its contents. The evidence was damning. Over $300,000 in HOA funds had been funneled into a shell company, one owned by Nancy and Robert. The so-called pool renovation fund had been nothing more than a front for their personal enrichment. James's anger boiled over. How many families had struggled to pay those assessments? How many people had been threatened with fines or foreclosure if they didn't comply? "You stole from everyone," James said, his voice steady but filled with quiet fury. "This isn't just about me anymore. You've been robbing the entire community." Nancy, for the first time, looked genuinely rattled. She opened her mouth, perhaps to deny it, but before she could, another voice rang out. "I want my money back." It was Mrs. Patel, a mother of 3 who had barely scraped together the funds for the last special assessment. Then another neighbor chimed in. "You lied to us." And another. "We trusted you." The tide was turning, and Nancy knew it. But she wasn't ready to go down without a fight. James knew that if they didn't act fast, Nancy and Robert would try to cover their tracks. That night, he organized an emergency neighborhood meeting at the community center. Word spread like wildfire. By the time the meeting started, the room was packed, more residents than had attended an HOA meeting in years. James stood at the front, a makeshift projector displaying the documents Eleanor had provided. Every bank transfer, every fraudulent invoice, every connection between Nancy, Robert, and the stolen money. "This is what's been happening behind our backs," James announced. "For years, we've been paying into a system that was never designed to help us. It was designed to benefit them." He pointed to the financial records on the screen. That money was meant for our community, but instead, it went straight into their pockets. The crowd erupted in outrage. Nancy and Robert sat near the back, arms crossed, their expressions shifting from smug to panicked. The questions came fast. What else have they taken? Can we press charges? How do we get rid of them? James raised a hand for silence. "The first step," he said, "is voting them out." A murmur of agreement swept through the crowd. "And the second," he added, "is getting law enforcement involved." Realizing she was losing control, Nancy resorted to one final, desperate act. That night, under the cover of darkness, she and Robert crept onto James's property with shovels and shears, determined to destroy what they couldn't control. The sound of snapping vines and uprooted plants filled the night air as they ripped apart James's beloved garden, their revenge fueled by spite and humiliation. But what they didn't know was that James had installed security cameras. The next morning, as James stepped outside, his heart sank. His garden, his hard work, had been reduced to nothing but a mess of broken stems and overturned soil. But instead of despair, he felt something else: resolve. He checked his security footage, and there they were, Nancy and Robert, caught red-handed. With a deep breath, James picked up his phone and called the sheriff. "I have something you need to see," he said. Within hours, Sheriff Martinez was back, this time with a warrant. Nancy and Robert were arrested on the spot, charged with trespassing, vandalism, and destruction of property. But that was only the beginning. With the financial fraud exposed and video evidence of their crimes, the case against Nancy and Robert was airtight. Investigators uncovered even more misappropriated funds, leading to additional charges of embezzlement and fraud. The community, once divided by fear and complacency, now stood together with newfound strength. The HOA board was dissolved, and in its place, the residents formed the Friendly Neighbors Group, a voluntary association dedicated to fairness, transparency, and genuine community support. No more arbitrary fines. No more power-hungry tyrants. Just neighbors working together for the good of everyone. As for Nancy, her house was seized and sold to help repay the stolen funds. She would spend the next several years facing legal consequences for her actions. And James? He rebuilt his garden, this time with the help of his neighbors, who saw in him not just a gardener, but a leader. On the day the last tomato plant was replanted, Eleanor walked up to him, a single ripe tomato in her hand. "For you," she said with a smile. "A fresh start." James took the tomato, feeling its weight in his palm. A symbol of resilience, of victory, of a community reborn. With Nancy and Robert out of the picture, the neighborhood had a chance to rebuild, not just its leadership but its sense of unity. For years, fear and apathy had allowed corruption to thrive, but now, people were ready to take control of their own community. The first step was dismantling the old HOA structure. In its place, James and a group of trusted neighbors formed the Friendly Neighbors Group, a voluntary organization where decisions were made transparently, without the heavy-handed enforcement that had plagued the past. The community voted to eliminate the arbitrary fines and replace them with reasonable guidelines that encouraged collaboration instead of punishment. James, though reluctant to take on a leadership role, was unanimously chosen as one of the guiding voices in the new organization. His fight had inspired others, and now, instead of fearing the next HOA letter in their mailbox, people were excited about what they could build together. The first order of business? A full audit of the HOA's past finances, ensuring that every misused dollar was accounted for and that the stolen money, where possible, was returned to the people who had been unfairly burdened by Nancy and Robert's greed. As the neighborhood worked on rebuilding, the scandal gained media attention. Local news stations picked up the story, fascinated by how a simple dispute over a vegetable garden had unraveled years of corruption. Journalists interviewed James, Eleanor, and other residents, documenting the abuses of power and the resilience of the community. "It started with one garden," James told a reporter, standing in front of his newly restored plants, "but it became about something much bigger. We weren't just fighting for vegetables, we were fighting for our rights, our homes, and our voices to be heard." The footage of Nancy and Robert vandalizing the garden played on repeat across television stations and online news platforms, cementing their reputations as symbols of HOA corruption. As a result of the coverage, more homeowners from different communities came forward with their own stories of HOA abuse, calling for reforms at the county and state levels. The scandal led to an official investigation into HOA practices in the area, prompting local lawmakers to draft legislation that would limit the unchecked power of HOAs, ensuring transparency and fairness in their operations. While the community celebrated its newfound freedom, Nancy and Robert were facing the full weight of the law. The charges against them included embezzlement, fraud, trespassing, vandalism, and destruction of private property, enough to ensure they wouldn't be coming back to the neighborhood anytime soon. During the trial, the prosecution laid out an overwhelming amount of evidence. Financial records proving years of theft, witness testimonies from residents who had been coerced into paying unjust fines, and of course, the security footage of their final act of vengeance against James's garden. Nancy's smug attitude disappeared entirely as she sat in the courtroom, forced to confront the consequences of her greed and arrogance. The judge, unimpressed with her attempts to shift blame, sentenced both Nancy and Robert to several years in prison, along with hefty fines to repay what they had stolen. Additionally, their property, once the symbol of their power, was auctioned off to help reimburse the neighborhood's stolen funds. The house that had once been the command center of their corruption was no longer theirs. Nancy had ruled the HOA like a queen, but now she had nothing left. With the drama finally behind them, James turned his attention back to what had started it all, his garden. His neighbors, many of whom had once been passive bystanders in the HOA's tyranny, now rallied together to help restore what Nancy and Robert had destroyed. Families came out with tools, children helped replant seedlings, and within weeks, the garden was not only restored but expanded. "We wanted to make it even better," Eleanor said with a warm smile as she handed James a tray of heirloom tomato seedlings. "A fresh start for all of us." The garden became more than just a personal victory for James. It became a shared space where neighbors gathered, exchanged fresh produce, and built real relationships, something that had been missing for years under the HOA's oppressive rule. It wasn't just about growing food anymore, it was about growing a sense of community. To commemorate their victory, the neighborhood organized a massive block party, the first of its kind in years. Gone were the days of stiff, formal HOA meetings filled with fear and tension. Instead, people laughed, shared meals, and enjoyed the kind of camaraderie that had been missing for so long. Barbecue grills sizzled, kids ran through sprinklers, and music played late into the evening. James, standing near his newly restored garden, took a deep breath and looked around. This was what community was supposed to feel like. Not control, not fear, but people working together for something better. As the sun set, Eleanor approached him with a small but meaningful gesture. In her hands, she held the first ripe tomato from the restored garden. "This belongs to you," she said, placing it gently in his palm. "A symbol of everything we've fought for." James smiled, feeling the weight of it, not just as a vegetable, but as a reminder of resilience, of standing up for what's right, and of the incredible power people have when they come together.